Thank you for being an incredible supporter of the 10X podcast group, the home of the skillful art of manipulation. We're thrilled to have you as part of our growing community. If you haven't already, we'd love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and help us reach a wider audience with our stories. Plus, with new episodes released every day, your feedback plays a vital role in shaping what we create. It truly makes a difference. Your loyalty and enthusiasm fuel our passion for crafting gripping tales, and we're so grateful for your support. Today, we're excited to present The Therapist's Experiment, a story that promises to keep you on the edge of your seat. Let's dive into this thrilling narrative together. Chapter 1. The Gate to Darkness. My name is Ethan Cole, and if I'm being honest, I never thought I'd find myself in a therapist's office. Therapy was for the weak. At least, that's what I had been raised to believe. My father was a hardened man, the kind who worked with his hands, who built things, who never showed an ounce of emotion unless it was anger or disappointment. He used to say that a man who needed to talk about his feelings was already broken beyond repair. I guess that meant I was broken. Sitting in that plush leather chair, the smell of sandalwood and faint incense curling in the air, I felt a strange sense of unease. Not because I was about to spill my guts to a stranger, but because this office, this entire environment, was designed to do something to me. It felt calculated, strategic, as if every book on the shelf, every flickering candle, every shade of deep burgundy was placed there with intention. It wasn't just an office. It was a trap, finely woven, expertly curated to lure people in and make them stay. And at the center of it all was her, Dr. Vivienne Blackwell. I had heard the name before. My best friend, Julian, had recommended her. He had called her a miracle worker, said she changed his life, told me that if anyone could help me navigate the suffocating mess my marriage had become, it was her. At the time, I had scoffed at the idea. Therapy wasn't for me. But now, here I was, watching as the woman sitting across from me folded her hands together, tilting her head just slightly in a way that made me feel like she already knew every secret I had ever kept. Vivienne Blackwell was unlike any therapist I had imagined. I had expected someone older, perhaps in her 50s, with a strict bun and thin lips that never smiled. But she was nothing like that. She was young, mid-30s at most, with dark, hypnotic eyes framed by long lashes. Her black hair was silky, cascading over one shoulder, and her lips were painted the deepest shade of red. She wore a fitted black dress, modest in design but clinging to her curves in a way that was impossible not to notice. And the way she looked at me, like a cat watching a mouse scurry into a corner, sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Ethan," she finally spoke, her voice rich and smooth, like whiskey poured over ice. "Tell me, why are you here?" I swallowed, shifting in my seat. I had rehearsed my answer 100 times before walking through that door, but under her gaze, I suddenly felt exposed raw, like I was standing naked in a storm. "My wife," I started, clearing my throat. "Things between us, they're not the same." Vivienne said nothing, only nodded slightly, urging me to continue. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. "She barely looks at me anymore. We don't touch. We don't talk. I try, but it's like she's somewhere else, like she's already left and just forgot to pack her bags." "And how does that make you feel?" Vivienne asked, her voice softer now, as if she were easing me into something deeper. I let out a bitter chuckle, like I'm the last man on earth. Her lips curled at that, not quite a smile, but something close to it. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her intertwined fingers. "You know, Ethan," she said, her voice like silk against my skin. "Intimacy, connection, they're like oxygen to a relationship. Without them, things suffocate. You suffocate." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "I just don't know how to fix it. I've tried everything, romantic gestures, conversations, even therapy before this. Nothing works." Vivienne studied me for a long moment, her gaze dissecting me, peeling me apart layer by layer. "Perhaps," she mused, "you're trying to fix something that isn't broken." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She leaned back, her eyes never leaving mine. "Maybe the problem isn't with your wife. Maybe it's with you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Me?" I echoed, my throat tightening. Vivienne's lips parted in something resembling amusement. "Tell me, Ethan, when was the last time you felt truly satisfied?" I stared at her, thrown off by the shift in the conversation. My mind flickered back, trying to pinpoint a moment. A time when I felt whole, when I felt alive. But I couldn't. "I don't know," I admitted. Vivienne's eyes darkened. That's exactly why you're here. I frowned, my hands curling into fists. I thought I was here to fix my marriage. She tilted her head, that knowing smirk returning. Are you? The question settled in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to argue. Wanted to insist that my marriage was the problem, that I was just another victim of distance and disinterest. But something in the way she looked at me made my certainty crumble. Ethan, she murmured, satisfaction is a science. A formula. And you've been following the wrong equation your entire life. I swallowed hard. Then what's the right one? Vivienne leaned forward, so close I could smell the faint trace of jasmine and something darker beneath it, something I couldn't quite name. I can show you, she whispered. If you're ready. I should have said no. I should have stood up, walked out of that office, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. And in that moment, I unknowingly handed her the keys to my mind, my body, my soul. That was the moment my life, as I knew it, ceased to exist. Chapter 2. The sessions begin. The second time I stepped into Dr. Vivienne Blackwell's office, it felt different. Maybe it was my imagination, but the air seemed thicker, heavier. The scent of jasmine and something darker, something musky and unfamiliar, clung to the space like an unspoken promise. The low glow of the lamps bathed everything in a golden hue, making the room feel more intimate, more dangerous. I closed the door behind me, my palms slightly damp. I told myself I was just here for therapy, that I was being ridiculous for letting a simple conversation linger in my mind long after I left last time. But deep down, I knew better. She was getting inside my head. I should have been worried about that. Instead, I was intrigued. Vivienne sat behind her desk, legs crossed, one perfectly manicured hand resting on the arm of her chair. When she looked up at me, it wasn't the look of a therapist greeting her patient. It was something else, something sharper. Ethan. Her lips curled into a smirk. You came back. I exhaled sharply, forcing a small laugh. I figured I should at least give therapy a real shot. She nodded, standing up. That's good. Very good. She gestured toward the familiar leather chair across from her. I hesitated before sitting, feeling the way the material clung to my skin as I settled in. It was ridiculous, but I felt as though I had just placed myself inside a cage. Vivienne circled her desk and took a seat on the couch across from me. This time, she didn't bother with the desk as a barrier. She wanted to be closer. The realization sent a strange thrill through me. So, she said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my throat dry. Tell me, Ethan, did you think about our last conversation? I swallowed. I had. Too much. I had replayed her words over and over in my head, had let them crawl beneath my skin, burrow into my thoughts like seeds waiting to bloom. Satisfaction is a science. You've been following the wrong equation. I had started to question everything. My marriage. My desires. My entire life. I didn't want to admit that, but something about the way she looked at me made lying feel impossible. Yeah. My voice was rougher than I expected. Vivienne smiled. Good, she murmured. She shifted, crossing one leg over the other. The movement was slow, deliberate, and I couldn't help but notice the way the fabric of her dress stretched over her thighs. I forced myself to look away. She noticed. You said your marriage feels empty, she continued. That your wife is distant. Uninterested. I nodded. Vivienne tilted her head. But tell me, Ethan, is it just her? I frowned. What do you mean? She leaned in slightly. Are you interested? Do you crave her the way you used to? Or are you just mourning something that died a long time ago? The question hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to say yes, that I still wanted my wife, that I still longed for her the way I did in the beginning. But the truth was, I didn't know. I had been so focused on fixing things that I hadn't stopped to ask if I even wanted to. Vivienne saw the hesitation flicker across my face, and her smile deepened. That's what I thought. I clenched my jaw. So what are you saying? That it's my fault? She shook her head slowly. No, Ethan. I'm saying that maybe you've been searching for the wrong solution. I exhaled sharply, leaning forward and rubbing a hand over my face. So what's the right one? Silence stretched between us for a moment. Then Vivienne stood up. She walked to the small table in the corner of the room and poured herself a glass of wine from a crystal decanter. She turned slightly, raising an eyebrow at me. Would you like one? I hesitated. I thought therapists weren't supposed to drink with their patients. She smirked. I like to break the rules sometimes. I shouldn't have accepted. I should have said no, should have reminded myself that this was supposed to be professional. But I nodded. She poured another glass and handed it to me before settling back onto the couch. I took a slow sip, the warmth of the alcohol settling in my stomach. Vivienne watched me for a moment before speaking again. "Tell me, Ethan," she murmured. "How often do you think about other women?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that I nearly choked on my drink. I coughed, setting the glass down, trying to ignore the heat creeping up my neck. I don't know." Vivienne tilted her head. "Be honest." My pulse throbbed at the base of my throat. I had thought about it. Many times. The waitress at the cafe near my office, with her bright smile and the way her blouse clung to her figure. The woman who jogged in the park every morning when I drove to work, the way her leggings outlined every curve. Even random strangers, women I would pass on the street, a flicker of something forbidden crossing my mind before I shoved it away. But I never acted on it. I never would. Would I? Vivienne was still watching me, waiting. "Sometimes," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips curled. "Describe it to me." I swallowed. "What?" She leaned forward, resting her elbow on her knee, her fingers grazing the rim of her wine glass. "Tell me what you think about. The details. The fantasies. What do you want?" My entire body tensed. This wasn't normal therapy. This wasn't what I had signed up for. And yet, I didn't stop her. I didn't stand up. I didn't walk away. Instead, I found myself answering her. "I think about what it would be like," I murmured, "to be with someone who actually wants me, who looks at me like I'm the only man in the world." Vivienne's eyes darkened. "And your wife doesn't?" I let out a bitter laugh. "I don't even think she sees me anymore." She nodded slowly, as if she had already known the answer. Then she set her glass down and stood up. She walked toward me, stopping just inches away. I could feel her presence, feel the warmth of her body. She leaned down, her voice barely a whisper. "You deserve to be seen, Ethan." I exhaled sharply, my pulse pounding in my ears. Vivienne reached out, her fingers grazing the side of my hand. It was the softest touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through my veins. "Trust me," she murmured. "I can help you." I should have pulled away. I should have left. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded. And in that moment, I sealed my fate. Chapter 3. The Descent. The next session changed everything. Before, I could lie to myself. I could pretend that what was happening between me and Dr. Vivienne Blackwell was simply therapy. Unconventional, sure, but therapy nonetheless. I could justify the long stares, the veiled touches, the way she spoke in riddles that unraveled me thread by thread. But that night, everything blurred. Everything burned. I arrived at her office a little past 8. It was later than usual, but she had requested it. Said she had a special session planned. That should have been my first warning. The building was nearly empty by then, the other offices dark, the hallways silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. When I reached her door, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the handle, my pulse hammering in my throat. Something felt different. The air was charged, humming with an energy I couldn't place. I should have turned around, but I didn't. I knocked once. The door opened almost instantly. Vivienne stood there, dressed differently this time. Gone was the professional dress, the strict lines of her usual attire. Instead, she wore something looser, dark silk that clung to her in all the right places, exposing just enough skin to make my thoughts stumble. She smiled. "Come in, Ethan." My mouth felt dry as I stepped inside. The office was dimly lit, even more than usual. The only light came from the lamps in the corners, casting long shadows against the walls. The scent of jasmine was stronger, mixing with something else, something richer, muskier. She closed the door behind me, locking it with a soft click. And just like that, I knew I was trapped. I just didn't know whether I wanted to escape. Vivienne moved past me, walking toward the couch. She poured herself a drink from the decanter on the side table, then glanced at me over her shoulder. "Whiskey." I hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." She poured another glass and handed it to me. I took a slow sip, the burn of alcohol doing little to calm my nerves. Vivienne sank onto the couch, tucking one leg beneath her, watching me with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Tell me, Ethan," she said, swirling her glass lazily. "What are you afraid of?" The question threw me. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "What do you mean?" She tilted her head. "You walk around carrying the weight of something heavy. I see it in your shoulders, the way you hesitate when you speak. There's something inside you, something clawing to get out. My throat tightened. She wasn't wrong. "I don't know," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Vivienne studied me for a long moment before setting her glass down. Then, slowly, deliberately, she stood and walked toward me. I didn't move. She stopped just inches away, close enough that I could feel her warmth, could smell the faint traces of perfume clinging to her skin. "You hold yourself back," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "You deny yourself the things you truly want." Her fingers brushed against my wrist, soft, featherlight. "You crave control, but you've never had it." I exhaled sharply, my hands clenching at my sides. "Ethan," she murmured, her voice dripping with something dangerous. "Let me teach you." I should have walked away. I should have told her no. But instead I stayed. And that was the moment everything spiraled. The session that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Vivienne didn't ask me about my marriage. She didn't ask about my past, my regrets, my fears. Instead, she asked about my desires. "What do you fantasize about?" she asked, leaning back against the couch, her legs crossed, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. I hesitated. She smirked. "Come on, Ethan. We've come too far for you to hold back now." I let out a breath, my pulse pounding. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." I exhaled sharply. "I think about what it would be like to let go." Her lips parted slightly. "Let go. To stop caring. To stop overthinking. To just take what I want." Vivienne's eyes darkened. "And what do you want?" she whispered. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I couldn't say it. I didn't need to. She already knew. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower. "Tell me, Ethan," she murmured. "What would happen if you let go?" My mouth went dry. "I don't know." Her smirk deepened. "Would you be a different man?" I swallowed. "Maybe." She nodded slowly. "Then let's find out." I didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. But by the time I walked out of that office, I had become someone else entirely. That night, I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly through the city, my mind a tangled mess of thoughts and impulses I couldn't shake. I thought about my wife, about the life I had built with her, about the promises I had made. But mostly I thought about Vivienne. The way she spoke, the way she moved, the way she looked at me like she could see straight through my skin, down to the deepest, darkest parts of me. I had told myself this was just therapy. But therapy wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to make my pulse race, wasn't supposed to leave me breathless, wasn't supposed to make my entire body ache with something I couldn't name. By the time I parked outside my house, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to fix my marriage anymore. I wanted something else, something far more dangerous. And worst of all, I was willing to risk everything to get it. Chapter 4, The Web Tightens. The unraveling wasn't sudden. It was slow, insidious, like a spider weaving an intricate web, one silken strand at a time. Vivienne knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't pull me into her world all at once. That would have been too obvious, too clumsy. No, she was careful, methodical. She planted thoughts in my mind like seeds, watered them with whispers, fed them with glances, nurtured them with her intoxicating presence. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was already too late. I was caught, trapped, addicted. And the worst part, I didn't want to escape. It started subtly. At first, I told myself it was just therapy. A different kind of therapy, yes, but still therapy. After all, wasn't the whole point of seeing a therapist to change? To be pushed beyond your comfort zone? That's what I told myself. That's how I justified the late-night sessions. The texts that blurred the lines between professional and personal. The homework assignments she gave me, tasks designed to make me confront my desires, my needs. "Do one thing this week," she had said once, "that you've always wanted to do but never allowed yourself to." It seemed harmless enough. I spent hours thinking about it. At first, my mind drifted to trivial things, skipping work for a day, getting blackout drunk, ignoring my responsibilities. But then, the thoughts turned darker. What if I let go completely? What if I stopped pretending to be the man I was supposed to be? What if I embraced the hunger that had been gnawing at me ever since I met her? I knew what she wanted me to choose. And I wanted it too. My wife noticed the change. Of course she did. She wasn't stupid. At first, it was small things, missed dinners, unanswered texts, my mind wandering mid-conversation. But then the distance became real, tangible, like a thick fog settling between us. One night, she confronted me. We were in bed, lying side by side but feeling miles apart. She turned to me, her voice hesitant, her fingers gripping the sheets. "Ethan, where'd you go?" I stared at the ceiling. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, frustration creeping into her voice. "I mean, you're here, but you're not. I can feel it. I see it in your eyes." I didn't answer. Because she was right. I was gone. I had left the moment I stepped into Vivienne Blackwell's world. The worst part, I didn't even feel guilty. The next session, Vivienne pushed. Harder than before. She leaned back in her chair, watching me with that knowing smirk, tapping her nails against the glass of whiskey she held so effortlessly. "You didn't do the assignment," she said. I shifted uncomfortably. No excuses." She tilted her head, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "Why didn't you?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of her stare. "I don't know," I muttered. "Yes, you do." She stood up, walking toward me, her movements slow, deliberate. She stopped just inches away, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Intoxicating, heady, like something forbidden. "Tell me the truth, Ethan," she murmured. I exhaled sharply. Because I was afraid. Her lips curled into a smirk. Afraid of what? I clenched my fists, my pulse hammering. "Afraid that if I start," I admitted, my voice rough, "I won't be able to stop." Vivienne's smile deepened. She loved that answer. She thrived on it. That's what I wanted to hear. She reached out, her fingers trailing down my arm, the touch so light it sent a shiver through me. "You're standing at the edge, Ethan," she whispered. "All you have to do is jump." My throat tightened. My entire body was screaming at me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let her touch linger. I let the moment stretch, let the tension coil around us like a noose. And then, I leaned in. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply waited, daring me, testing me. And I failed. I closed the distance, pressing my lips to hers in a desperate, hungry kiss. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was filthy. It was raw. It was wrong. And it felt so fucking good. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. I sat in my car outside her office for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind a chaotic mess of guilt and desire. I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And yet, I didn't regret it. If anything, I craved more. That scared me more than anything else. But it was too late. Vivienne Blackwell had her claws in me now. And she wasn't about to let go. Not yet. Not ever. Chapter 5, The Ruin of Men. The unraveling wasn't immediate. It never was. Destruction doesn't happen in a single, earth-shattering moment. It happens in increments, in subtle cracks spreading through the foundation until the entire structure collapses under its own weight. And Vivienne? She was the master architect of my downfall. She didn't break me all at once. That would have been too easy. Too obvious. No, she did it slowly, deliberately, piece by piece, ensuring that by the time I realized what was happening, I had no way of clawing my way back to the surface. I had drowned in her before I even knew I was sinking. And I wasn't the only one. I wasn't the first. And I sure as hell wouldn't be the last. The devourer of men. Vivienne had a system. A process. A methodology as precise as any surgeon wielding a scalpel, cutting just deep enough to sever the things that kept a man tethered to his life, but not so deep that he bled out before she was done playing with him. I didn't realize it at first. I thought I was different, but I wasn't. I was just another fly caught in her web. And there were so many of us. I started noticing the others after that first night. The first time I kissed her, the first time I gave in, the first time I crossed the line I could never uncross. Before, I hadn't paid attention. I had assumed her other patients were like me, just men looking for therapy, for guidance, for answers to the things in their lives that felt broken. But after that night, after I became hers, I saw the truth. They weren't just patients. They were victims. And they didn't even know it. Neither did I. Not yet. The first casualties. The first time I saw one of them break, it was at a bar. I had gone out for a drink alone, something I never used to do before Vivienne entered my life. But lately, I found myself avoiding home, avoiding my wife, avoiding everything except her. I was sitting at the counter, swirling the amber liquid in my glass, when I overheard him. His voice was low, slurred, dripping with something between anger and grief. She fucking ruined me, man. I turned my head slightly. The guy was in his early 40s, maybe older. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, the bags under his eyes deep enough to suggest several sleepless nights. His friend leaned in. "What are you talking about?" The man laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Vivienne fucking Blackwell." That's what I'm talking about. My stomach dropped. I gripped my glass tighter, listening. She got inside my head, he muttered. Made me think she was helping me. But she wasn't. She just tore everything apart. He ran a shaky hand through his hair. My wife left me. My kids won't talk to me. I lost my job. And for what? His friend frowned. Jesus, man. What did she do? The man exhaled sharply, looking down at his drink. She made me need her. My pulse pounded. I wanted to believe he was exaggerating, that his case was different, that Vivienne wasn't doing the same thing to me. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. The lies we tell ourselves. The next session, I confronted her. Or at least, I tried to. I sat across from her, gripping the arms of the chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was a guy at the bar last night, I said, my voice tight. He was talking about you. Vivienne raised an eyebrow, sipping her wine. Oh, he said you ruined him. She smiled. And you believed him? I hesitated. She leaned forward, setting her glass down. Ethan, she murmured, do you know how many weak men I've treated? My throat tightened. I push them, she continued, her voice smooth as silk. I challenge them. And some can't handle it. She tilted her head slightly, eyes locked onto mine. Does that sound like you? I exhaled slowly. I don't know. She reached out, her fingers trailing down my wrist, her touch electric. You're not like them, Ethan. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But something inside me, some small, dying piece of the man I used to be, was screaming at me to run. I didn't. I stayed. I always stayed. The beginning of the end. My wife found the messages a week later. It was late. She was sitting in the living room when I walked in, her phone in her hands, her eyes red and shattered. Who the fuck is Vivienne? My stomach dropped. My mouth opened, but no words came out. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Jesus Christ, Ethan. I knew something was wrong, but I never, her voice cracked. I never thought it would be this. Don't. Her voice was cold, cutting through the air like a blade. Don't you fucking lie to me. I swallowed hard. It's not what you think. She let out another laugh, but this one was hollow. Oh, it's not. She held up the phone, scrolling. Because it sure as hell looks like you've been fucking your therapist. I didn't deny it. I couldn't. Her face crumpled. I thought we were broken, Ethan. But I thought we could fix it. She shook her head. I was wrong. She stood up, pushing past me. Where are you going? I asked, panic creeping into my voice. She turned to me, eyes empty. Away from you. And then she was gone. Just like that. Vivienne's victory. That night, I drove to her. I knocked on her door, my hands shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. She opened it, wearing nothing but a silk robe, her dark eyes calm, as if she already knew what had happened. I stepped inside without a word. She closed the door behind me. Then she smiled. And in that moment, I realized the truth. She hadn't just ruined me. She had planned this all along. You said, Chapter 6, The Turning Point. You don't wake up one day and realize you've lost everything. It happens in fragments. A slow erosion of the life you thought was solid, crumbling piece by piece until one day you look around and realize there's nothing left. No home, no family, no self-respect, just the wreckage of what once was. And Vivienne Blackwell stood at the center of it all, watching, smiling, like a goddess admiring the ruins of a kingdom she had burned to the ground. I was just another casualty in her war. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't see, was that I had finally opened my eyes. And I was about to turn the game against her. The fall before the rise. After my wife left, everything spiraled fast. I lost my job within the month. Maybe it was the constant distraction, the missed deadlines, the way my mind was always tangled in thoughts of her. Or maybe it was the rumors, the whispers of an affair. My boss called me in one afternoon, gave me some bullshit speech about professionalism and company values. Then he handed me a severance check and showed me the door. That should have been my wake-up call. It wasn't. Instead, I drove straight to Vivienne's office. Straight to the woman who had already consumed me whole. She didn't look surprised when I walked in. She never did. She simply glanced up from her desk, her lips curving into that knowing smirk that sent heat curling in my gut. Well, she murmured, setting her pen down. That didn't take long. I swallowed hard. She's gone. Vivienne arched a delicate brow. Your wife. I nodded. She leaned back in her chair, running her tongue slowly over her bottom lip, as if tasting my despair. "And how do you feel about that?" My throat tightened. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She already knew. That night, I ended up in her bed. There was no pretense anymore. No need for whispered therapy sessions or feigned professional boundaries. She had won. I was hers. And she knew it. Her nails raked down my back as she rode me, her breath hot against my ear. "Now," she purred, pressing a kiss to my jaw, "there's nothing holding you back." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that losing my wife, my job, my entire fucking life meant freedom. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't free. I was trapped in something even worse. And Vivienne Blackwell was tightening the chains. The others. In the days that followed, I started paying attention. Really paying attention. And what I saw made my stomach twist into knots. I wasn't Vivienne's only project. I wasn't the first man she had ruined. I wasn't even the worst case. The more I looked, the more I saw them. The broken men. The ones who left her office with hollow eyes and shaking hands. The ones who had given up everything, their careers, their families, their entire sense of self, all for a woman who never once planned to keep them. I saw the way she looked at them, the way she used them, the way she toyed with them until they were nothing but empty husks waiting to be discarded. And I saw what happened when they were no longer useful. One man, a guy named Daniel, had been one of her earliest victims. I found him at a cafe near her office one day, hunched over a cup of black coffee, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. I sat across from him. He barely reacted. "She did it to you too, didn't she?" I asked. His bloodshot eyes flickered up to mine, and for the first time, I saw recognition. He knew. He understood. "Run," he rasped. I swallowed hard. "What?" He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get out while you still can." I stared at him, my pulse pounding. She won't stop," he muttered. "Not until there's nothing left of you." I felt something cold slither down my spine. I thought back to my life before Vivienne, before her experiments, before the way she twisted my mind into knots, making me crave her, need her, worship her. I had nothing left. And yet, I couldn't make myself walk away. Not yet. Not until I got what I came for. The game changes. That night, I went back to her. I found her in her bedroom, lounging in silk sheets, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I entered, her lips curving into that same goddamn smirk that had once driven me insane with want. "Back so soon," she murmured. I didn't answer. I walked toward her, slow, deliberate. Something must have shifted in my expression, because for the first time since I met her, Vivienne hesitated. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to catch it. I leaned in, pressing a hand to the curve of her hip, my mouth hovering just inches from her ear. "You've spent all this time studying me," I murmured. She shivered under my touch. I smiled. "But you forgot something important." Her breath hitched. I traced my fingers up her thigh, slow, measured. "You taught me everything." Vivienne stiffened slightly. I pressed my lips to her ear, whispering the words that would change everything. "Now it's my turn." For the first time since I met her, she was the one who looked afraid. And I had never felt more alive. The beginning of her end. In the days that followed, I turned the tables. I started using her own methods against her. I planted doubt. I twisted words. I manipulated her the way she had manipulated me. And little by little, I saw it happening. I saw the cracks begin to form. She started questioning herself. She started slipping. She started losing control. And I was just getting started. Vivienne Blackwell had destroyed so many men. She had played with lives like they were pieces on a chessboard, pushing them toward ruin just to see how far they would fall. She thought she was untouchable, unbreakable. But she was wrong. Because in the end, even the queen can be taken down. Chapter 7. The predator becomes the prey. Power is an illusion. It only exists as long as people believe in it. The moment doubt creeps in, the moment the person in control starts to second-guess themselves, everything collapses. Vivienne Blackwell spent years perfecting her craft. She knew how to mold men like wet clay, shaping them into the version she desired before crushing them with the precision of a master artist, smashing a sculpture she no longer found beautiful. But there was one thing she never considered, that one of her creations might turn on her. That someone might study her, learn from her, use her own game against her. That someone would be me. And now, for the first time in her life, Vivienne was the one losing control. The moment she knew. She sensed it before she saw it. That's how manipulators operate. They don't just react, they anticipate. They read the energy in the room before anyone speaks. They listen to the things left unsaid. They analyze the slight shifts in tone, in expression, in posture. So when I walked into her office that night, I saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It was there for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She wasn't used to this version of me. Before, I had been the perfect patient, eager, desperate, malleable. She had led, and I had followed. But now I was something else entirely. I shut the door behind me slowly, letting the lock click into place with deliberate ease. She was sitting on the couch, one leg crossed over the other, wine glass in hand, as poised as ever. But I could tell she wasn't as relaxed as she wanted to appear. She was studying me, waiting. I smiled. "Vivienne," I murmured, my voice smooth. "You look surprised to see me." She raised a perfectly sculpted brow, tilting her head slightly. "Should I be?" I walked toward her, taking my time. "I don't know. Should you?" Her eyes darkened. And that's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. The subtle destruction. Breaking someone isn't about explosions. It's not about a single moment of impact. It's about erosion. Slow. Methodical. The same way she had done it to me. And so I began to unravel Vivienne Blackwell piece by piece. I planted doubt where once there was certainty. I questioned things I never would have questioned before. "Are you sure this is the best approach, Vivienne?" I would say casually in our sessions, watching the way her lips would press together for just a fraction of a second before she answered. I withheld things she expected me to share. She was used to knowing everything about me, my thoughts, my fears, my weaknesses. But now I gave her just enough to keep her wondering, to make her work for it, to make her realize she wasn't in control anymore. And it drove her insane. The first crack. The first time I saw her truly shaken was during one of our late-night meetings. She had poured us both a drink, as she always did, her silk robe slipping slightly off one shoulder, her eyes dark and full of something dangerous. She leaned in, trailing a perfectly manicured finger along the rim of her glass. "You trust me, don't you, Ethan?" I smirked, lifting my own drink to my lips. "Should I?" She stilled. It was a tiny moment, so small that most people wouldn't have caught it. But I did. A hesitation. A flicker of something she never showed. Doubt. Fear. I let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of it pressing down. And then, for the first time, I watched Vivienne Blackwell struggle for control. It was beautiful. The lies unravel. She started slipping after that. She was used to being the one pulling the strings, but suddenly the strings were tangled. She started second-guessing herself, rephrasing things mid-sentence, searching my face for reactions she could latch onto. But I gave her nothing. She started watching me too much, trying to read me, trying to understand what had changed. And that's when she did something I never expected. She broke her own rules. Vivienne Blackwell, the woman who prided herself on patience, on control, on precision, made a mistake. She called me. Late at night. Unplanned. Her voice was smooth, careful, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness she was trying to hide. "Ethan," she murmured, "I missed you tonight." I leaned back in my chair, smirking to myself. "Did you?" She laughed lightly, but I could hear it, the uncertainty, the hesitation. She was trying to keep me on her leash. She didn't realize she was already on mine. The final move. The night I ended it, she didn't see it coming. I walked into her office, closing the door behind me, watching as she sat at her desk, her fingers curled lightly around the stem of her wine glass. She smiled. "I was beginning to wonder if you were avoiding me." I tilted my head, letting the silence drag just a little too long. "I've been thinking," I said finally, "about our sessions." Her smile didn't waver, but something shifted in her eyes. "Oh," I nodded, stepping closer. "You taught me a lot, Vivienne." Her expression softened, just slightly. "I'd like to think so." I leaned down, my hands bracing the desk on either side of her, my face inches from hers. "And I finally understand something," I whispered. Her breath hitched. "What's that?" I smiled. "You were the experiment all along." Her lips parted, confusion flashing across her face for just a fraction of a second. But that was all I needed. I straightened, slipping my phone from my pocket, tossing it onto the desk. She glanced down and froze. The screen was filled with recordings. Texts, emails, evidence, every manipulation, every unethical practice, every twisted method she had used against me and so many others. I had documented everything. She paled. "Ethan." I leaned in again, lowering my voice. "I wonder what the licensing board would think," I murmured. "Or the media." Or your next potential patient. Panic flickered in her eyes. For the first time since I met her, she had no control. For the first time, she was the one being played. I turned, heading for the door. Her voice was barely a whisper. Wait. I paused, looking over my shoulder. And then I delivered the final blow. You should have chosen a different patient. And with that, I walked away, leaving Dr. Vivienne Blackwell in ruins.